All right, welcome everyone. Time is 4:03 p.m. I appreciate everyone being here today. In between this meeting and the last meeting, from your input, we put together two documents that were distributed out about a week ago. One kind of going through a summary of uh, the sections of rule and some recommended changes, and then some notation about things if there's no change at this time to talk about. And what I thought we could do today, if it works for the group, is I can bring up kind of both of those documents and we can just kind of walk through and get your input, and then go to the next step. Your review today, and then any other review that would come in from the rest of the committee who isn't able to be here tonight. I will say that we did not, Sherry, did you receive anything to you today from other committees?
No, I'm checking right now. It's gone for the past hour or two, but I'm going to check right now.
Okay. Scott had sent in a couple of questions on that. Not his was actually after the last meeting and before the drafts. We haven't gotten anything back from anybody else in writing yet to share with the group here today. So let me go ahead and do a share screen and we can get going. And let me move some windows around here and I can make that bigger. How's that for readability for folks? Good? Okay. All right, so jumping in, the first section in definitions, which arguably is one of the areas of, I think, the greatest feedback, particularly around record, permanent record, on those changes. We did, the approach that we took was trying to actually remove those distinctions because they were really tied into like a 30-year-old model of how the different pieces could work that was driving that specific language, and then try to strengthen in the other rules what was meant by that with, we hope, better language throughout. So that would be something that first, and let me pop over to the rule on striking permanent record and record and trying to be more clear in that. How does the committee feel about that? Was that an okay approach? Did that seem to work out? Got a thumbs up, some head nods. Okay. Then, based on the discussion that came out with inarguable repair and protective techniques about interventions, we didn't make changes in those areas because either the determination was that between the statutory limitations on being able to make a rule change for some of that, or that there was clarity was already sufficient in the rule. We could provide some more policy or clarifying questions on that. But the definition of that went back, that suturing is actually included even in the common definition of interargumentary repair and protective techniques. And then ADL, IADL, that there isn't a conflict with the OT scope, just in the way the exemptions work between the two scopes. It's okay that it appears in both places. There's no direct conflict there. Come back to the definitions. One of the new pieces that we put in place when the committee was asking for more clarity around competence and further defining it in other rules, a recommendation to put in a definition for evidence-based practice This is something that's come up not just with this Rule Advisory Committee, but with other questions that have come from licensees. So the recommendation is put this in place so then the references on competence can tie specifically to this as well. And watch your eyes, I'm going to scroll. That adding that one there results in some renumbering. The final piece was on telehealth service to not make any changes at this time, in part because there's broader ramifications in how the telehealth rules are currently defined. And the underlying recommendation to adopt the Model Practice Act language is tied into the statute, because the Model Practice Act is a statute. And so if there's a change there, there would need to be a corresponding change here. So that is what drove the recommendation not to make a change at this time, but see if something will happen at the statutory level, and then have some broader discussion about the telehealth rule that would tie back to the definition without creating some unintended consequences by just modifying the language here a little bit. And that would be the proposed changes under definitions. So just pausing there, any other kind of comments or questions that the committee has for the definitions section or concerns? Okay. And pop over to the other document. The next section of rule is the general standards of practice. This is part of where the clarity on competence came on. And so in this area, I'll roll forward and you can see this would be the proposed rule clarification under part 1. And part of what we were trying to do is make it a little bit more concrete. In looking at how other jurisdictions, other PT boards handle the idea of competence, as well as some of the broader literature, it really comes to this, how practice applied with the appropriate knowledge, skill, and degree of care relative to a common standard. One of the legal advice on this is if we get too prescriptive in the definition, it could actually have a detrimental impact, because it could create like minimum hours or certifications or some other things that aren't relative, but would then be hoops that everybody would be required to do in every instance. And that didn't seem to be what the committee was raising to us. And so we stayed with sort of the more relative answer, but tried to make it a little bit more concrete in what those standards would be and how it would be applied. Okay, and at any time, just, jump in or raise hands on that. I think the next section was about displaying a license, and that was one. I'm going to scroll here. Under part 7, and the analysis of this is that there was some question of that you can't always display it, or you're not always in a place where that can be posted on a wall for the patient, but that the current rule actually already does allow for the ability of electronic verification from the board's website, so that you can make that available to a patient and you can produce it on request, which is part of the board's intent. And so that recommendation could be, it is allowable under the existing rule. Okay, I'm going to scroll. Then that brought up the next section. There were some questions on healthcare interpreters, and then specifically what if the practitioner themselves was proficient in the patient's preferred language, if they could act in this role, yes, that you can do that. On this one, it ties into OHA's statute under 413 and their rules, which this is trying to parallel. But in their process that requires all healthcare professionals to offer individuals who are on the interpreter registry and then certain documentation requirements. But one of the allowable criteria is that if the individual is proficient in the patient's preferred language, then you can, in fact, act as an interpreter. So no change in this section. We are internally, before we would go to the board, because the exemptions that, pardon my scrolling, were put into Part C. Those were initially put into our rule to create exemptions to address the original version of the statute, because this went to 2 legislative sessions and they inadvertently created some problems in school-based settings. And so we created these exemptions to clarify the issue. They came back and changed the statute where we probably don't technically need these exemptions anymore because the statute itself provides that clarification. We will go back and see if they could be repealed, but we may also recommend leaving it in place just so it's clear in our own rules that it's not required in school-based settings. So you may see something come out of this in the future, and that would be why. Then we get into standards for record keeping. This was fun to draft. So this is our attempt to try to boil down all of your great input on this and to move away from record, permanent record, and some of those other pieces and streamline a thing. So as you can see, the changes here, we're shifting from this idea of a record, which was kind of a temporary piece before it went into a permanent record, that it references that written documentation will be prepared on the date of a PT service is provided. And then 3 is trying to better state what a permanent record was meant to be, that if you're not already documenting it in whatever electronic record system that you're working with, and you're out in the field or the power's down and you're using a clipboard and paper, that the documentation has to be added back into the patient's record, appropriate for the care setting. We tried to leave some flexibility here, where if you're in acute care, a timely manner may be 24 hours, right? If you're in a school setting, but never longer than 7 days from when the date the service was provided. And that the entry has to include the date of entry if it was different than the date of service. So that was our attempt to try to account for all the input that you had raised and sort of the differences in different care settings. So then you'll see, like in part 4, referencing documentation, pulling out the reference to permanent or record.
Don't know if you're scrolling. My screen is still on the general records standards for record keeping, record versus permanent record. So we're talking about 3 and 4, and I'm still seeing that.
Okay. Are others?
Me too.
Okay, so you're not seeing the scroll?
Mm-mm.
Okay, let me stop sharing and restart it. Okay,
It's good now. Thank you.
sure. And were folks able to see the 3 previously before it locked up?
No,
Okay, so let me leave it there for a moment.
thank you.
Absolutely. Okay. Okay,
Good, thank you.
absolutely. 4, 5, and 6 are just changing some of the references to permanent record or record. Changing to this idea of the documentation that's being referenced. Number 8, let me scroll a little bit here. This is where we landed on trying to address the fact that the input here was around some question about, are there even standard abbreviations? And also the concern that increasingly patients have direct access to their records and have some questions and need to be able to understand that. But it was somewhat difficult to create a standard in the rule of you will use these, you will abbreviate this way, or you won't ever use abbreviations. So we thought this approach would allow for the flexibility in the different care settings, but still make sure that it could be accessible, that if you do use abbreviations, that it is accessible to anybody who is reading the material, including the patient, if you choose to use those. Okay. 9 to 10 are just referencing the patient record to clarify that. And I believe that was it for that section. So I'll pause there. Just any other questions or comments on the rules here, Joni?
Just to give you all a heavy thank you for making these changes and clarifying record and permanent record. I'm probably one of the people that struggled with this the most. And with relative ease, really, you have cleaned up this section, and it's great. Thank you.
I'm laughing because you said relative ease. Think about 3 meetings between Michelle and me of going back and forth of like, what do we put here? What are the blah, blah, blah. So I'm glad it looks like it was easy. And it flows nicely. It was, I think it's a lot better.
Yeah, and I do have to just say that without the discussion and the input from all of you to conceptualize it and see all the pieces and all the different settings, that was just essential to try to cut to the gist and clarify this in a way that works. So I just have to turn the compliment back around to all of you.
I agree.
All right. Let me pop over to this document. Oh, I see what's happening. Okay. I thought I have the 2 pages open in this one window, but it looks like it is pausing my screen sharing when I go to the other document, and then just do that. So I will, let me just pop over there, take a quick look. Okay. In 117, the only change here was a recommendation or a comment. Somebody said, we're 10 years out from 2014. Could we maybe remove this from the rule? Great question. What we had to do was rewrite it because the rule formatting is very particular about when you have an opening paragraph and then when you have the numbers and the letters. And so we didn't want to lose that open paragraph entirely. So we restructured the opening one and parts of number one to rewrite this so it didn't throw off all the rest of the numbering. But essentially, it says pretty much the same thing that already existed without the reference to the change in date. Okay. Next section. Pardon my scrolling. 120. Primary feedback was clarification was needed on referrals and who can take and document those, and that it can be challenging to track down a provider to have them follow up in writing when there's an oral change. So in that, as I scroll forward, we made these two changes under part 2 and part 3 to both clarify who can receive the oral referral and then also to be a little more realistic about where the responsibility for trying to track that down ends. That essentially you have to document that you tried to get the written on that, but the original text essentially held you accountable or delayed care if the doc didn't provide that follow-up in writing. Look okay? Okay. And I do want to highlight that, we're going through essentially, this is the draft that will go to the board at their meeting later in November. That would be the proposed draft that if they vote to initiate rulemaking, that opens up a public comment period for everyone to review these proposed changes and provide feedback. And then it would go back, any of that feedback would go back to the board again we're presuming at their January meeting. Schedule hasn't been set yet, but we expect to have a meeting in January. So you as well will have more months to tweak things or give input. So this is just if you feel that this represents what'll go for that initial proposed draft for the board to review. So it's not your only bite of the apple on that. Doesn't have to be your final answer. Standards for initiation in the next section. Some of this was mostly cleanup. Two things here from what was raised. Instead of specifying licensed healthcare provider, because some folks, particularly in the school setting, reference that they aren't necessarily a health provider, licensed health provider. So it just says another provider to be a little less specific in those cases. And then, of course, the reference to the patient record more broadly to allow for the differences across different care settings. And I'll scroll slowly here. Let's skip over B for a moment. C is adding in condition or body part based on the discussion, I think, at the last meeting. And then back to B. And I don't know, Sherry, if you want to, on this one, we tried to clarify this a little more than where it was limited to inpatient or outpatient facility or home health agency. We tried to write it a little bit more broadly.
We were trying to remember why it said new to that. From what I remember, that rule was written to cover for like if somebody is at a clinic and they're being seen and then they switch to a different clinic, that they would still need, not in the same system, that they would still need to have, they'd have to have a new evaluation. But I thought this language was just a little more clear than just calling it inpatient or outpatient or home health. Like there was more than inpatient or outpatient. Like maybe a school would be a facility.
Mm-hmm. And I think I'll scroll forward. I think, yeah, that's those are the only changes proposed in this section. Okay. I think we're to initial eval. Yeah. All right. So here, and I'm going to scroll past the red so that you can see that this is new language that's being proposed to replace quite a bit of the existing language, actually all of it in that section. So all of the existing rule language is fully replaced by this language here in red.
I
And
was
this was
very happy when I saw this. Thank you.
Yay. Yeah, we really tried to take your direct input and some of the examples that have been looked at and just try to reframe it. Joni?
This might be getting in the weeds, but do we want to say that somehow identifying the patient, like their name and record number, or however people are identifying patients out there? Just a thought.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we could do like a number one, patients identifying information, just state it that broadly. And that would cover, instead of full name, age, sex, identification number.
I like that. Because even if it was age, it'd be more like date of birth than age.
Yeah. Okay.
Would it be worth to add preferred name? If we're going to put the patient's identification, sometimes preferred name does not match legal name.
I think it depends on if we want to, because we could either say something very general about patient identifying information and not specifying what that is, but leaving that open.
Yeah, I think that would be better.
Okay. Yeah. That also makes it more flexible that in the different care settings, you might have different specific requirements of how that has to be captured or what number you use specifically. And then also I know OHA has different requirements for different surveys or demographic information they want you to take, so this is more resilient, right? It doesn't lock it down into particular information and allows it to change over time. Okay, so we will add like a new number one and bump all of that down about the patient's identifying information or, sufficient or something like that. Great. Be scrolling. Section 135, plenary minor language change in part 4. And then in part 5, adding in this language. Based on your input. Okay. Okay. Section 140, this is mostly, taking out the permanent record, and some comments last time about that what was meant by treatment was really therapeutic intervention. So changing the language here. Joni?
Did you take out the word record from other sections of this group of ruling? Like
We
record,
did.
permanent record. So should it just read the plan of care shall include ABC?
I think here we were leaving record because it was like, because we talked about that, whether we were going to call it documentation, but that record was actually like the writing down of it was record. Like you're recording it. So that someone doesn't say, I did it, I just didn't write it down.
No, and I'm good with it. I just, I get in the weeds sometimes.
Yeah, but we actually talked about that, like purposely leaving it in the places where it's like where you're recording it down or writing it and not repeating the word documentation too many times. But I mean, we're open if someone has a better idea of what to call it.
It could also, we did think that it was just like to create a record of or to document. So the documentation of the plan of care shall include, and then the documentation of the plan of care shall be authenticated. So we could use documentation instead of record.
I like documentation.
Yeah. Okay. Everyone else good with that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Joel?
Just a quick question on the word frequency. Was that something that we saw in the Washington and California as well, that they had that same frequency, duration, number of visits?
They some variation on that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But left kind of open-ended, not dictating how many or
Right.
Yeah. Joni, did you have a?
I was just going to say that frequency and duration mimics Medicare language. So for most folks, I think writing a plan of care, that's pretty standardized.
Just confirming. Yeah.
Okay, so on this, in the draft that goes to the board, we'll replace the 2 instances of record or record, I don't know which, to documentation or to document. Okay. Standards for providing treatment. This is another part of the thread around competence and being a little more clear to tie back to the definition, as opposed to this was almost like a subset of the definition used earlier. But essentially, intervention is only when competent in that intervention. And then we tried to give clarification in part 3. So there's a lot going on here. This language would be removed. So it would read, except as provided in the other section. And I should remove the strikeout here. A physical therapist assistant shall not continue to provide treatment to a patient unless a patient has been re-examined by a physical therapist. However, a PTA may provide treatment on the day a re-examination is required, so long as during that treatment day, a physical therapist re-examines the patient. I'm just making a note to unstrike the A. Okay, any other comments or thoughts on this section? Joni?
A question or clarifying question on number 5. The supervising physical therapist means either the last PT to see the patient or the physical therapist designated as in charge. And I'm just thinking of situations like a traveler. An agency therapist could have been the last person to see the patient. And then, maybe this person moves on to see a PTA. The agency is now in Oklahoma. I mean, are they really your supervising therapists? So.
Yeah, and this rule, I think the update was just in the last 5 years, and part of it was attempting to create sufficient flexibility for when there's a change or when there are travelers, so that it's either the initiating one or somebody who happens to be available that day. It can be either or, it can change over time.
Yeah,
But
no,
it's
and I'm
attempting to
fine
give
with
that
it.
flexibility.
I was just trying to get clarification for myself. So
Yeah, that's what it should be doing. If there's, like, if it doesn't feel like it's achieving that, then we can try to make it more clear. And while you're looking at that, Hamina?
Yeah, I actually had a question in number 3.
Okay. Let me scroll the screen back. Now you can see both.
So my question is, let's say that a patient is scheduled with a physical therapist assistant, and for what I understand when I'm reading this is that as long as the physical therapist in charge of the plan of care re-examines the patient that day, it is okay for that PT assistant to provide treatment, but it doesn't really provide clarification of who signs the note. Because, for example, in our outpatient clinic, the PT assistant has his own schedule, and I know a PT could come in and provide the examination, that is necessary if it come down to like that last minute they found out that the patient needed to be re-examined. But then the PT assistant will be the one signing the note. So I think providing clarification is, doesn't need a co-signature. It would avoid you from getting emails asking about this.
I mean, I think it gets clarified further on when we get to the section on re-examination.
Okay.
Because this is a weird rule. We had to go back to this one because there's a whole specific section on when the re-examination has to be done. But this one was just like sort of generic, like you can't keep seeing a patient if the re-examination wasn't been done. But when we get to that, let me know if what you think hasn't been addressed.
Okay.
I think it is.
Okay, thank you.
And I'm also gonna, in the meantime, just flag it so that we track it, that it may need clarification. And Joni, did you have other thoughts on number 5 before we move to the next section?
no, just that question.
Okay. Okay. 147, though, no substantive changes. We just noticed some repetition of cutting down a few words using the abbreviation that was already defined earlier. So then standards for documentation of treatment provided, moving away from record. And here what you see, continuing this, moving from treatment to use of therapeutic intervention. And then removing like the including but not limited to. So it's just assessment of the patient's response to therapeutic interventions, updates to the plan of care, a supervising physical therapist may document treatment provided by a physical therapist assistant if, because we're going to skip over that, the supervising PT records and authenticates treatment provided by the physical therapist assistant. The physical therapist shall document which treatment interventions were provided that day by the PTA. When treatment is provided or assisted by an aide, the aide may only document objective information about the treatment intervention provided by the aide. Supervising PTA or supervising PT authenticates treatment by an aide. Therapist should document which treatment. So just paralleling that same language. I'm going to scroll back just a little bit so we can see. Thoughts or questions on this section? Okay. Let's scroll forward to 155, formerly known as Standards for Performing a Reassessment. Based on all the discussion and different perspectives, we settled on language use for standards for reexamination. A physical therapist shall reexamine a patient, and then we're introducing some flexibility by using periodically. Anytime there are significant changes, the Part A stays. Part B is struck out, so it removes that specific 30-day requirement for reexamination as defined here. And introduces this relative concept of 30 days or longer from when the patient last had a visit in the clinic, which could have been with a PTA. It does leave the 60 days in the schools, but it does strike out or at every visit if seen less frequently based on the feedback there.
Michelle, with that one, I'm just wondering, I'm just trying to process if that's going to be more confusing for folks, because if there could definitely be students that they don't see every 60 school days based on how the IEP is written. And so does that really give that instruction for that situation?
I think what we were thinking is that right now it has to be at least every 60 school days, or
Because previously that or at every visit
Yeah.
if the student is seen less frequently, now there's no clause for the less
Yeah.
frequently, which would require them to follow 60 days, even if it's
Mm.
Mhm.
not appropriate for the IEP.
Yeah.
Do you think it's better to leave it in there, Erin?
I do. I don't
Okay.
know what's better. I guess at that point, like, you know, I don't know what's better, but like a different way to say it in a better way. But I do think it'd be problematic if it just says 60 days.
Okay.
I don't remember what our exact conversation was around that to
Yeah, and I'm thinking maybe that in the note taking that we, because even looking at it now, I think the reading that clause was being read differently, where it was less frequently than 60 days. And it's like, well, why have a interval that's less than 60 days if you have a max of 60 days? But the way the intention was that every 60 days, or like if you don't see him for 92, that 92, right. So
Right.
yeah, I think based on kind of that input and what you're saying, that it would make sense to not remove this clause.
Okay.
Everybody okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that. So this is now part C. Okay. In part 2, this both uses reexamination instead of reassessment, and then it is using broader language similar to what you saw in some of the other jurisdictions. So the patient's status, and update the goals or plan of care. I'm going to move this to part 3 and 4. Reexamination. A PT shall not delegate the reexamination to a PTA or to an aide. And then part 4 is new language based on some of the discussion about that some of you raised about having clarification about when the PTA is seeing the patient, what sort of the proactivity, the expectation for being proactive about raising concerns to the PT. So any other kind of thoughts or questions about this section 155? Okay.
Michelle, did we get any, I don't think we did, but any feedback from the PTAs on the committee? I was specifically thinking of like Jen or Jeannie, because I just love to just run that number by the two of them. Highlight, maybe I'll just send that out to the two of them.
Yeah, and
So
then
not
Lisa,
here.
and then Joel, I think, has questions or comments, but we could get Lisa's thoughts on that specifically.
Oh yeah, sorry, Lisa.
Yeah, I guess my concern is that it sounds like treatment must stop then, whereas instead of something like, the physical therapist needs to re-examine the patient in a timely fashion. I mean, there's definitely situations where the treatment should stop, but it wouldn't be all cases. I don't know. I'm just being the devil's advocate here. I mean, I can see a lot of clinics being like, whoa, the therapist isn't going to be back for a couple weeks, and this is, yes, they need to have a change in goals, but at the same time, maybe it's fine the way it's written. I'm just talking it out.
the way the rule was written before, it did have to stop. So if it was day
Okay.
31 or 32 and a PT hadn't done the reassessment, the PTA couldn't keep seeing the patient. So it was pretty strict, like a PT, not the PT, but a PT had to see the patient. But it really didn't say what, it's just based on a time, a 30-day time. This is based more on if these things, I think the concern,
Got
at
it.
least for me, is people, someone who sees bad things, right? It's like something's really wrong with the patient and the PTA just keeps seeing them and the PT doesn't get involved.
Yeah.
Not because it's 31 days, but because something really needs to happen, whether it's day 20 or day 65.
Yeah, and it's kind of in removing the 30 days and adding some clarification here to try to provide that flexibility for places where it's hard within the 30 days because the patient had, you've only seen them maybe once or twice.
I just wanted to talk it out.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's good on that clause there. Lisa, what do you think?
I like the changes. I do have one question. I feel like there's kind of two scenarios coming up, but the same re-examination being used for both scenarios. One scenario is the kid just hasn't been in for 30 days, right? The other one is they just had some major setback or some major change. I guess my question is the way we're currently doing it, I'd maybe tell one of the PTs, hey, I need eyes on this patient. I just want to get your feedback. Can you take a look at this patient when I see them today versus something has drastically changed and we need to completely change the plan of care, which to me would mean that patient needs to be on the PT schedule. Like, I don't know if that makes sense, but I see two different levels of need for PT input, maybe, if that makes sense. And I'm trying to figure out if this reexamination provides for both levels of supervisory check-in versus a reassessment that reexamination is actually needed and new goals and whatever. I don't know.
Other thoughts on that? There is that 30-day interval, like if the patient hasn't been seen at all by anyone, it would trigger at that 30-day, if I understood the first scenario that you had. And that's mostly existing requirements, so they're just removing the every visit piece of it. And then if there is a significant I think this is intended to cover both if there is a significant change in condition or something that would trigger a change in goal or a plateauing where no progress is being made, and it may not make sense for the asking the PT to come in those situations as well. But I would also defer to you all.
And maybe if it's broad enough, then it really can be up to the PT and the PTA deciding in that particular scenario. Does this need to be a full-on reevaluation, basically, or is this a check-in kind of a thing? Get your eyes on the patient.
Yeah.
I would hope once the PT has their eye on the patient, they would be able to make that decision and make that call, how much of their intervention is needed.
And this is intentionally different than like the formal, Medicare requirements and that language, which has very specific requirements if that's applicable.
I like this. I think this will really help out our clinic for sure in the pediatric world.
Okay. Okay. Then 160 is, of course, about documenting the reexamination. And tried to simplify this language. So changing reassessment to reexamination. So subjective status of a patient and any change in the goals or the plan of care. And then removing out some of the more specific language that was there originally. Which makes part 2 the idea of the progress note. Joni.
Well, you read my mind because I was wondering, do we want to say progress note there? Which is a progress note, a daily note? Because progress note in a Medicare way is different than a daily treatment note. So just clarifying what you really want to say there.
What do you think we want to say there?
Probably
Should
not
we-
progress note.
Okay. It used to be a progress summary. Is summary a better, like, don't change that? Is that more clear? Or change it to must prepare documentation of the patient's current status? Or how can we best frame that?
Because now that you're using reexamination, which again could be confused with reevaluation, which is a term Medicare uses. And then throwing in progress note there, and I'm just shooting from the hip here, but I feel like progress note is a little confusing because that is a different entity.
Okay. And so to reduce the potential confusion, don't use
I think
that.
why we put progress note, sorry, is that so many people ask about the progress note and we weren't addressing it. And there's so many facilities and different intervals of when a progress note is required. And we were always getting this, can the PTA do the progress note? Can they do the progress note? What we've been trying to tell people for years is we don't require the progress note. If they do it, we are allowing it to be done by a PTA. If somebody else says it can't be done by a PTA, well, then it can't be done. The payer says a PTA can't do it. So I think that was the thought of changing it to note, because we always had questions about the progress note. It's not there anywhere.
Go ahead,
Sorry.
Jenny.
I was just going to say, because a Medicare progress note, I mean, the purpose of that is really to justify the medical necessity of treatment. And that's not totally what you're doing here. So it's different.
Does that have to be done by PT?
Off the top of my head, I would say yes. But I will find out.
Okay. Lisa?
Yeah, I would say that the way it's written right now makes me feel like a new report needs to be generated and go to the doctor. And I'm not sure that that's what you mean, versus they may prepare documentation of the patient's current status. Yeah.
It might be better to leave it, because that's exactly what comes up, Lisa, is who can send the note to the doctor. I mean, maybe it's better to just be silent about it, and because we don't require that note to go to the doctor. The board doesn't require that. It's probably one of the top questions I get. Can a PTA write that note? Who can write it? So we're trying to be a little more clear, but we don't. My answer is always we don't require a progress note. So if you write it, you write it, and if the insurance company requires it to be done by a PT, then it has to be done by the PT. We always had this just generic, like the PTA can do it from our standpoint. Just like the same thing with the discharge summary, right? So we allow, so maybe going back to summary is better, or leaving it out is
Do
better.
we need part 2 at all?
That's what I'm wondering. Maybe just don't have it.
Well, you're already saying that the physical therapist re-examines the patient and documents that re-examination. And
So we
so
could either stop
why do
there,
we need to talk about the progress note?
right?
Yeah.
Do we stop there or do we strike 2 entirely?
That's what I was kind of, we just take it out.
I mean, we're assuming, I guess, that the physical therapist who is doing the re-examination is also documenting it.
Yeah, and this is that the documentation that when it's performed, the record of the reassessment shall include at a minimum these things. We would just be silent on who has to either enter that documentation if we struck number 2. If we leave number 2, but just leave it the first part of the sentence, then it would require it to be done by the PT and only the PT.
To me, it makes sense to put a period after documents the re-examination, period. But that's just me.
So only a PT can document the re-examination?
Well, really, how would a PTA document it if the PT did it? Were they standing there watching it exactly?
Mm-hmm.
So actually maybe this is really getting in the weeds, but in my setting, there would be times when maybe the PT would I'm seeing the patient, the PT comes over and does some measurements while I'm there too. And then I usually document in my note, the supervising PT was present and performed such and such documentation. I don't know. Another random note is in number 1 there. The second part of that sentence, it says the record of the reassessment. I wonder if that's somewhere else that we would change the documentation of the reexamination just to match everything else.
Oh, you know what? When you just said that, in number 1, Michelle, it said the record of the reassessment. That should say reexamination in number 1.
So both those things, record and reassessment. Good catch, Lisa. Sherry, thank you. Okay, so we can flag number 2. Stay away from the language about progress note. And then either strip back number 2 to be that this is something the PT documents, or be silent on that. I've heard where it might be useful both ways, so we could even put that forward as like options in what moves forward for now, to allow more time for thinking about that. Joel?
I was just thinking to keep it as it is and just take out progress note and put they prepare the documentation of the reexamination. I even say what that documentation is, but that may not be a smart move either.
Okay. Okay, so we'll play with this a little bit more. We can always send some options out to y'all, get some input on, but you know, we can at least flag that this needs more work, and maybe some options when it goes to the board. Okay. Discharge. See how much I can get on a page. Change in number 1, just care instead of treatment. And in part B, we had a lot of conversation about how best to do this. But to add the language that regardless of whether additional visits are ordered or authorized, or regardless of whether the patient desires to continue with the treatment. And what we're trying to address there is that you can discharge if there aren't any further benefits from PT, even if the patient feels that they could. And then you can get into conflict on that. Removed this or is removed just because we're adding another section. So these are all, they stay ors, but the or moves down with the E. And this idea of if the PT for any reason cannot provide sufficient evidence-based care for the patient at that time, and the therapist isn't able to transfer the patient to another physical therapist. This is similar to that same situation where the patient wants to keep going or wants to go to a specific provider, but the provider for whatever reason isn't able to meet their needs, that you can still discharge the patient if there's not another option. And then just some clarification to the language that was brought up in number 3. So it seemed that some strikeout would work for that. And let me go ahead and move forward to the standards for discharge records. Shifting to the idea of the episode of care, moving away from the specific 30 days. It does currently still keep what should be in the discharge summary. And then in part 3, discharge from care. And then we did propose striking out this language about inpatient care facility as defined in 442. And then the big add is in number 4, that if a patient self-discharges or fails to return, the last encounter note will serve, I suppose that'd be serve and not service, as the discharge summary. And the idea of what there was, I know some folks had asked about, could you put like standard language that was at the bottom of every note or every entry that said this summary, if the patient self-discharges, this will serve as the final record. But rather than requiring the same words to be entered into the system, taking up space every single time, writing it this way, which just says, in this rule, it says it counts if this has happened. Joni?
I got really stuck on this because I feel like, well, there's many things that I'm feeling about this, but one, we've set up like 2 standards now. We're saying you need to discharge patients, and here's the reason that you're going to do it. And in fact, here's the things you need to include in the documentation. But if you just sit on your tuchus and wait for the patient to just not come back, if that's what you mean by a self-discharge, then you don't have to do anything. So why would a PT ever write a discharge summary? Because we just gave them permission to not do it. And I also think it's going to get super confusing with Medicare patients, because Medicare does require the documentation of a discharge summary. And I think it's be very difficult for even very astute practitioners to be able to keep that in their brain. Oh, I don't have to discharge that one. I'm just going to let it sit there for a really long time. But I have to discharge this one. I think we've really set up some confusion here. That's
So
what
how do you feel about, because the recommendation, which was essentially the same, was to allow a common notation at the end of every visit that said, if the patient discharges or fails to return, this encounter note serves as the discharge summary.
Well, I don't think that meets any standard. It certainly doesn't meet Medicare standard, right? Which says you really have to document the summary at least since your last progress note, or you could go in and write a discharge summary that outlines the entire episode of care. So while many people use that as a easy way, if you will, but I don't think it meets any standards. And I review a lot of practice acts. I can't think of any jurisdictions that don't require a discharge summary. This would really be stepping outside of norms. And again, I think we set up two standards. And then you have to ask yourself too, what is discharge? Is discharge the process and the thought process that a therapist has to make a decision that somebody is being discharged from care, and then you document that decision-making progress? Or is it just, they just don't come in anymore? And then if we think that's what it is, then why even have a standard at all? Okay, that was a lot, I know.
It's good. Other thoughts?
You know, one thing that's always on my mind is being careful not to over labor documentation. And this does that. I mean, it reduces potentially a laboring of documentation. Also, when patients fail to come back for therapy, which is not an uncommon situation, and even with the most diligent therapist calling and trying to get information, and you know, we're not going to have any more information than what we had previously. And you can look at all the documentation up to that point to understand the thought processes that happened. So why is the therapist needing now to try to come up with some sort of thought processes, you know, as to why they're discharging? But I also, you know, see Joni's side of things as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, and I'm not even sure that, you know, a therapist has to go back and write a treatise as to why this patient's being discharged. I mean, you could say, you know what, we haven't seen the patient in the clinic for 40 days. We don't know their status, but we are going to discharge it in our system. When we write that discharge, we're able to close the referral and kind of clean up some loose ends. So.
Okay. So I think it's fair to say that the committee is mixed on this particular piece, right?
I mean, there is a point at which you are closing the referral, you know, typically, I would think that there's some action being had. Yeah, sorry, I'm not adding very well.
I appreciate just kind of talking through it. And I know we wanted to get, or at least some people wanted to get rid of this 30-day concept, but do you just leave it with no time frame? I think there's a lot of systems and practices that don't necessarily have documentation guidelines. So we really do look for to the board to provide those guidelines. Yeah.
Okay. And so, Joni, in that, would you recommend somehow keeping a 30-day?
At least for us, I think some sort of timeline is helpful. I don't know that it has to be 30 days, or, you know, I don't know what that ideal time frame is, but it has to be, I feel like it has to be something. I feel like we're just going to get these records sitting there and nobody ever is going to write a discharge summary. They're just going to let it sit there. And then I don't know, is that what we want? I mean, it's certainly doesn't line up with Medicare. And I think you guys have made significant efforts of kind of lining up so we don't have different standards for all these different payer systems.
What is the purpose of the discharge?
According to Medicare, I mean, you've summarized the episode of care into one document, but it also is the clinician's last chance to provide any justification that they may need to put into the record for medical necessity. Kind of like a progress note is, this is your justification for medical necessity. The progress note is your last effort to be able to provide that for the record.
Okay. And so that wouldn't be something that would already be in the prior encounter notes or records?
It might be,
But might not be.
but it might not be.
Okay.
I think if you're charting well, it should be.
What
You
I'm
know.
thinking about the discharge summary is that what seems to come up, and I struggle with this too, because if it's more than 30 days, even at 30 days, this happens, that person, we have a lot of travelers, we have a lot of temporary people working, that person's gone. And then some other therapist is asked to write a discharge note. They're collecting a bunch, like if we had a requirement that you has to be there, a bunch of charts are sitting on somebody's desk who's like, write a discharge note. And they don't even know who the patient is. So they just summarize what the last visit was and they write a discharge note, just for the formality of writing a discharge note. Because I get that a lot. Like, this person's not here anymore and they didn't do their discharge note. So now I have to write them, or it's been this many days and that patient, that PT's already moved on. So I don't know how to solve that. Like, I'm afraid if we make it a longer amount of time, that will happen. That would be worse.
Okay. Good discussion.
I still side on the side of keeping this as it's written, but that's just my opinion.
Keeping part 4 as introduced?
Yeah,
Or,
yeah, exactly.
okay.
Bill, can I ask you, what's your setting?
Outpatient ortho.
Okay.
Yeah, and so what's actually written generally isn't even most of the time very much of a big summary. It's just patient has decided to self-discharge by not returning to therapy. And that's the note. And then we close the referral. So
What happens if, so is there, in your different care settings, is there a action that has to be taken in order to close a referral? Or is that what the discharge note does? And I'm getting back to where Joni said that if folks just let things hang out, and they don't write discharge notes, does that mean that their systems don't require the referral to be closed out, or some other kind of mechanism to close out that process?
my gut feel is that there may be a system that will auto close the referral after, a year or something like that. Of disuse.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, our system would probably auto close in a year.
It actually could be shorter at Providence now that I think about it. I think it does close sooner than that because we sometimes run into that issue when someone hasn't been back for a while.
Yeah, that would create definitely a huge backlog. And then again, I have to go back to Medicare requirements. So now we've got these two different standards. And if we
Sure.
could marry them somehow so it's the same, it'd be so much cleaner for every practitioner.
Okay. Lisa?
Yeah, I don't know that we have a system other than the most recent doctor's orders will obviously expire at a certain point, but our dilemma in our setting is we might have patients that don't show up. We keep trying to call and schedule them, and the 30 days go by, and that discharge thing is like, that's our line in the sand. Like, you have to come back or call back by this time, and then boom, here's this line. I'm afraid of losing our line in the sand, but maybe that needs to be more of an organizational line. I don't know.
Okay. So you would also advocate for keeping the 30-day or some kind of specific time requirement?
I would advocate for some kind of a time requirement, because it also takes that burden off of the therapist when you have a family who keeps pushing. No, we were just gone for 2 months. That's all it was. Instead, the therapists have something to back them up and say, I'm sorry, this is the law. This is what we have to do. I don't know that it has to be 30 days, but that would be my very mild vote.
Okay.
Well, Lisa, I think you bring up a great point, because it's an access to care issue. If people just keep hanging out on the books and making appointments or don't come back, it kind of, in some ways, limits the ability to see new patients. And I don't know about your facilities, but we have more patients than we can manage. So, if people aren't interested in coming in, we want them off the books. We want to close that referral. We want to be moving on, seeing new patients.
Okay. Great discussion. We will, I think this one may not be quite ready for review with the board, or we might try to summarize the different perspectives and pieces of it and see what they come up with. But we'll also take this and see what we might be able to come up with and send it back out to y'all ahead of that meeting. But at a minimum, we would flag that, those perspectives. I don't think we made any changes in screening services. There were some questions about what some pieces of it meant. And then I don't think we didn't make any other changes on that. So that's the end of the potential proposed rule changes. Let me stop the share for a sec. Any other kind of final thoughts or input for us? We'll type up kind of the points that everyone made today and send that back out to you. But otherwise, what we would do is we would take the revised draft along with some of the comments where there's still some open questions or some disagreement, and that would be prepared to go into the materials that would go out to the board for their consideration at the November meeting, which is the 22nd of November. We'd also love if any of you happen to be available. I know everybody's really busy, but anybody who is available that would like to be there or be part of the presentation to the board in a walkthrough, let us know. And you can either be part of the presentation or you can just be there to observe or answer any questions. It's a public meeting, so it also gets recorded, so you can always, watch it on tape.
Michelle, are we thinking of doing it towards the beginning of the meeting?
I think last time we sent out a time that we were trying to do it toward the beginning of the meeting. I think we put out 9 o'clock, 9 a.m.
That's what I thought. Okay.
Yeah. I saw a hand, but then it went away.
No, that was my question. I was just what time of day were we kind of looking at? So,
yeah.
Is that a virtual meeting?
It is, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you. I think you guys have done a great job on this.
Thank you. We couldn't do it
you.
without you, so appreciate it. All right. Well, with that, I'll give you some time back to your evening. And then we'll type some pieces up. Sherry and I are at the Federation of State Boards meeting leave Wednesday. So it will likely not be back to you until early next week.
Well, it's great that these rule change suggestions that you guys are working on together are just so easy to make. So
Absolutely. Thanks, Joel.
Now, Really, I mean, boiling down all the discussion points to where you guys got it, I mean, really good. So you've obviously spent a lot of time on it, and we appreciate it.
Agreed.
Thank you all.
Thank you. All right. Go off to
Michelle, can you stick with me when everyone leaves?
Yep.
Okay.
Night all.
Night, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.